You all for being here. My name is Denise Specht and I am president of Education Minnesota. We are 1 week away from the traditional first day of school in Minnesota, the first Tuesday after Labor Day. Many districts are starting late this year, of course, but we decided this would be a good day to update you all on the challenges schools face as they try to safely and equitably reopen their buildings. We're meeting at a dangerous time. Confirmed cases are increasing, especially in the suburbs in southern Minnesota. Our health commissioner is using words like alarming and walking off the edge of a cliff in her briefings. The numbers are trending toward trouble and those Labor Day parties are coming up. Against that backdrop, you will hear today from educators about the lack of funding for what we've been asked to do this fall, about the persistent problems with meeting the needs of our families of color, and about testing policies that still need work. But first, you will hear about a problem that has our attention at Education Minnesota. Thousands of educators have health conditions that put them at high risk of serious illness or death from COVID-19. And there are also thousands of educators who have susceptible family members at home. It may be impossible for anyone to be completely safe in a nation where even stopping the spread of a deadly virus is political, but our own state can lower the risk to these educators by offering certain accommodations. We expect district administrators to follow the law in regards to these accommodations. And if they don't, our members can rest assured that their union will use all legal means at its disposal to protect the rights of the most vulnerable educators and their families during this pandemic. I will have some final thoughts following a short program, and we expect to have time for 10 to 15 minutes of questions. But first, let me introduce our speakers today. Sarah Haavisto, a teacher in Two Harbors, who will share her story about a district that kept her in limbo for a month while she worried if her job would put her daughter in harm's way. Marty Fridgen, a music teacher in South Washington County Schools and president of the United Teachers of South Washington County, who will talk about continued policy failures. Maria Higueros-Canny, a teacher of multilingual students in Osseo, who will highlight some common shortcomings in making back to school safe and equitable for families of color. Heather Bakke, a special education teacher in Gibbon, Fairfax, Winthrop, who will remind us that going back to school didn't have to be this difficult. I'm going to ask that our speakers say and spell their name when they begin their comments. Sarah, you're going to be first.
Sarah Haavisto, S-A-R-A-H, Haavisto, H-A-A-V-I-S-T-O. Hi, my name is Sarah Haavisto and I teach kindergarten in Two Harbors. This is my 11th year teaching and this school year is unlike any other. As we transition back to learning in whatever form that may take, we need to make sure that our schools are equitable and safe for our learners and our staff members. School districts should. There are many districts that are facing opening up without a clear plan of how to address the needs of our staff members. Mine is certainly one of them. In the middle of August, we were asked to submit requests for accommodations to our district office. These accommodations need to be accompanied by medical documentation of either yourself or someone in your care. I had previously put in an accommodation request at the beginning of August and then formally resubmitted on August 14th. I don't have any medical concerns. However, I have a 16-month-old daughter and she was born at 29 weeks. Because of her prematurity and complications from prematurity, she is considered high risk for respiratory illness, including COVID-19. In the meantime, I hung my hopes on even if I did not get approved for accommodations, that I wouldn't be in a classroom with 25 students daily. I began searching out PD for distance learning teachers and working on how to build rapport with students via Google Meet instead of hands-on games in our classroom. I also began looking for other jobs, things I could do if I wasn't able to teach distance learning or if my request for accommodations was denied. I and my family waited in a world of limbo for a month. I did not hear anything back from my district until last week. At that time, the district office asked what accommodations I would need. I immediately sent back that I needed to be allowed to work from home, attend staff meetings and trainings from home, and meet with students and families via Google Meet for the safety of my own child. The next day, I received an email back requesting further medical documentation. When I asked if what they had already received was insufficient, I did not hear back. Last night, I received a phone call from my principal that the administrators had just met, decided that my request for accommodation shouldn't have a problem being approved, that I could work remotely, that I should plan on attending workshop work week remotely. And as I breathed a sigh of relief, I realized that the enormity of being the only grade level teacher working as a distance learning teacher. And I realized across the state, teachers are still waiting for that phone call, and many of them are not going to get it before their first day back. Distance teaching is one of the hardest things I've done. My lesson plans took me twice as long to complete each week, including the development of hands-on activities that all my students could access, the creation and distribution of materials to students so that all of our students had the same opportunities. Instead of sharing these responsibilities with my team this year, I will be creating everything on my own, making videos as well as live teaching, leading small groups and daily check-ins with students. And when teachers are in fact, we're maybe even begging for more work.
I think we may have lost Sarah. Hopefully we can get her back on. Let's move next to Marty. Marty?
Marty Fridgen, MartyFridgen. Good morning, my name is Marty Fridgen. I'm a music teacher and currently serving as president of the United Teachers of South Washington County. Protocols around reporting of COVID are extremely important. Staff and students are coming into our buildings for hours at a time and need to trust that there is a standard protocol in place and that it is used consistently. In my district, like others, we have a protocol which has been set in place with guidance from MDH. However, with the many new safety procedures, preparing for a new learning method with the hybrid model, new technology, and movement of staff to different positions just in the last couple of weeks, it is easy for that procedure to be overlooked with the amount of work needing to be done. Last week was our workshop week. During that, we experienced confusion over something we all expect to hear frequently this fall. A teacher tested positive for COVID-19. This teacher followed the protocol as they understood it. They told their administrator and filled out a district reporting form. When the teacher was not contacted back, they became worried and notified their colleagues that they had contact with during workshop week. The teacher also contacted our union. We contacted administration to make sure the form had been received. Looking into it further, we found the district protocol in this case was to log the positive test without telling anyone, including the person who tested positive or the people who were near that person. In communicating with the teacher further, a different message was given to them from MDH and their doctor, which did not match the district's protocol put in place with MDH guidance. At a time when people are so nervous about their safety and those around them, and there's so much we don't know, this kind of confusion is unacceptable. Administrators, teachers, parents, and students must be on the same page. All districts need to make protocols around reporting a priority. Not only do they need to make it a priority, they need the transfer of that information around the protocol to be a priority for all stakeholders. If not, it leads to feelings of mistrust and lack of transparency, which is what we do not need, especially during a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Maria.
Hi, good morning. My name is Maria Higueros-Canny. The last name is spelled Higueros, and then it's hyphenated, a second last name of Canny, Canny. I am here today because I teach multilingual learners formerly known as English language learners, in an elementary school in Brooklyn Park for Osseo area schools. I'm here today to assert that when the policies of any district do not specifically recognize the needs of students of color and the needs of multilingual learner families, then those policies are biased against those families and they need to be called out and changed. Previously, my district planned to use a hybrid model of combined in-person and distance learning. My district's leaders realized it was a mistake and decided to start the first 2 weeks of the school year in distance learning. Going forward, racial disparities and the needs of multilingual learner families must be taken into account for plans to reopen the buildings of District 279 and similar districts and throughout the entire school year. As we know, communities of color are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Latinx, Indigenous, and Black communities are experiencing higher hospitalization rates than their white counterparts. In Minnesota, people of color make up 63% of the deaths among adults under age 64, even though they are just 16% of the population. When the school leaders in Osseo chose a hybrid model, despite having an extremely high population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, it appears that the district leadership were appealing to its more privileged West Side, a population that may not have witnessed the devastating impacts of COVID-19 due to systemic inequities. This hybrid approach was permitted because the county numbers are used to calculate infection rates for school districts. This method hides the true damage this pandemic does to certain communities. Let me give you some examples. Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center have some of the highest COVID rates in the county. Brooklyn Park has 57% residents of color and 28% speak another language other than English. Brooklyn Center has 61.5% residents of color and 34% speak another language other than English. 14 schools, largely on the east side of the district, are identified as over 50% students of color. Overall, students of color account for 58% of the student population in Osseo area schools. As of August 10th, Brooklyn Park COVID-19 cases were 33.6 per 10,000. Brooklyn Center COVID-19 cases were 42.2 per 10,000. Whereas on the other side of the district in Maple Grove, COVID cases were 13.4 per 10,000. It is not equitable to look at only Hennepin County data when our communities of color are affected at such high levels. I know my district is not the only district that has failed to engage families of color and multilingual families in reopening plans. Several of our staff have heard concerns and questions from our non-English speaking families. Even after the district attempted to communicate with multilingual families, many did not understand the process, the choices, or the deadlines for enrolling in our district's distance learning program called the Distance Learning Academy. And how could they? And I know because I am one of those people who has received all those calls and text messages. Communications from the district often come out in English first, with a delay in communicating the same information in the other languages of our community. Some documents are never translated or made available in other languages. Many districts have talked about equity this summer. Fewer have put in time and resources to make those words meaningful. Educators of color are tired of having the language of equity used without true commitment to decentralize whiteness and its social, political, and economic hold on our schools. When communities of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, it is essential that districts center their health and concerns. Our state needs to develop more creative and equitable solutions that provide educational access and meaningful participation and do not risk the lives and well-being of our beloved students, families, and employees. Every district has the option to follow a more conservative return to school plans if they feel that it is in the best interest of their students and staff. We urge them to take it.
Thank you, Maria. Heather?
Good morning. My name is Heather Bakke, spelled Heather, and Bakke, Bakke. I'm a special education teacher in Gibbon, Fairfax, Winthrop schools. I also represent Education Minnesota members on the board of directors for the National Education Association, one of our national unions. There are many challenges that are still facing school districts that want to open in person. One hurdle is the refusal of the U.S. Senate to approve the HEROES Act, which provides nearly $1 trillion to help states, school districts, and local governments to stabilize their budgets. The Trump administration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is making it nearly impossible for schools to reopen safely and equitably. Our country wasn't prepared for the virus. Now, Senate Republicans are forcing states to fend for themselves as they deal with massive budget deficits. The HEROES Act passed the U.S. House in May, but the Republican-led U.S. Senate failed to act for months and instead proposed a woefully inadequate relief package with no money for state or local aid. Minnesota stands to receive $1.3 billion in education funding from the HEROES Act. If the economic damage brought by the coronavirus pandemic goes unchecked, Minnesota will lose more than 48,000 education jobs over the next 3 years, according to an analysis by the National Education Association. Our economy, our schools, our jobs, and our way of life have been disrupted. To survive and recover from this pandemic, safely reopen our schools, and allow people to safely return to work to restore our economy, we have to maintain critical state and local services. That includes public schools. We have to remember that parents and teachers and educators ultimately want the same thing: a quality education for our children. Public schools want to provide the services that children and families depend on, but without funding to put the proper safety procedures and protocols in place, educators, school staff, and the children will be in harm's way. Right now, public schools are fending for themselves to find a way for PPE, cleaning supplies, fixing sinks, additional technology, and more. Senate Republicans need to pass the HEROES Act now so our schools can reopen safely. 3 months is way too long to wait. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I spoke to many of you at a news conference in July. We were outside overlooking the state capitol. I said educators were committed to getting back into classrooms quickly if it was safe and if our districts had the right things for our communities of color. Some schools have found a way to reopen safely. Some educators feel ready and secure in their employers' plans for students and staff to teach, learn, and work in person. And this is wonderful news. We recognize the planning and effort that went into that. On the other hand, there are educators who said this summer they were ready to go back into the classroom, but they've changed their minds. They've seen the plans for their own districts and concluded they don't work. Now their doctors are telling them that working from home is their only safe option. Some teachers have even switched districts to find accommodations for their own health problems. And that's fine. Our union can support any educator, superintendent, or school board member who now sees the problems we've discussed in a new light. Reopening the buildings in a politicized pandemic and a national racial reckoning is the most difficult thing any of us in education has ever done. If it takes more time, fine. Take the time. Back in July, we closed our news conference with 3 points, and they still apply. Learning safely is the goal. It should be done in person when we can and at a distance when we must. What is safe must be defined by the latest data, the best scientific analysis, and with an eye on the racial disparities that haunt our society. Looking at county numbers is not enough. Learning models reflect what is safe to do in the buildings. Educators should not be bullied by an arbitrary start date someone wrote on a calendar a year ago. Second, race matters. Educators of color have spoken. Parents of color have said in survey after survey that they are deeply concerned about sending their children into school buildings while the pandemic is burning through their communities. Everyone deserves a say in these decisions, no exceptions. And the third point is this. What our public schools look like in September will probably not be the way they look in November. It's imperative that policymakers at all levels create spaces for frontline educators, school staff, and parents to make their voices heard. Thank you all for listening today. Now we will have time for a few questions, and I ask that you either raise your hand using the emoji at the bottom or drop your question into the chat box. Chris Williams is going to help us navigate the question time right now. And if you have a question that isn't answered, just email Chris Williams and he will connect you with me or one of the speakers this afternoon. Okay, Chris, are you going to help us with the questions?
I certainly will. And just to amplify something that Denise said, we had a little audio problems when Sarah was speaking. We spoke before the news conference and all of our speakers are going to be available for follow-ups this afternoon. So I can help you connect with Sarah and hear her story a little bit more later on today. Sarah, we appreciate you giving us a little extra time to do that. So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand in the chat box and I will call on you and we will get you answered. I would ask that if you have not put your media outlet into the name on your your Zoom handle, if we could have that, that would make it a little easier to call on enough people. Thanks. And I'm looking for questions.
Chris, it looks like I'm getting some private ones for some reason. So Mara with the Star Tribune has a question.
Sure, let's start there. Mara, can we, let's take Mara off mute and hear her question.
Yeah, sorry about that, Megan. I meant to ask the whole group, but yeah, again, Mara with the Star Tribune. And I was just wondering if you could kind of explain the process of asking for accommodations. This is more of a question maybe to Sarah's experience, and offer a little bit of explanation of perhaps what could be improved in that process.
Hi, Mara. Our process was just to email into our district office. They also requested that we include a doctor's note explaining why we needed accommodations. The biggest hangup, I think, was that there was no contact back. There was no communication about whether or not those were approved. And no, there also has not been any conversation about teachers who are working as distance teachers not needing to go into the building per the governor's order. It's just been kind of a silent world where we ask and there's been no answers.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that.
Chris, could I add to that, please? I mean,
Sure.
Sarah's example is one that we hear all over the state. According to the governor's executive order, accommodations should be made. There really should be no question here. We are in the middle of a pandemic. These are challenging times, and we expect compassion and flexibility on behalf of the districts for our educators who are preparing to do essential work, and they need to be accommodated. So there should be no debate or question that accommodations should be made. Unfortunately, there are so many inconsistencies out there. Every district is handling accommodations differently. Unfortunately, many are not hearing, as you heard from Sarah, many are not hearing in a timely basis. We've got examples of educators who have just decided to leave. We're just done because they haven't been able to get answers or find a suitable accommodation that meets their needs. There is just really absolutely no reason for this. And at a time when we were having a teacher shortage before COVID, we have a teacher shortage now, and it's not going to get any better.
All right.
Thank you. That answered the question. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Mara. Next up, we have Heidi from Care 11. Can we unmute Heidi?
Hello. My question is, when you talk about delaying the start date for school, if schools aren't ready, would that apply to distance learning as well? And then kind of my second question is, when talking about racial equity and some of the challenges, I know people have brought up some of the issues with not having in person and having to do it through distance learning. So how do you kind of navigate those challenges as well? Thank you.
Maria, would you like to take the second part of that first without putting you on the spot?
Sorry, could you just repeat the second part one more time?
Yeah, I know when talking about racial equity and some of the challenges, I know some people have said having distance learning would be more of a detriment than having people in person. So how do you kind of balance like both safety and making sure the learning is equitable?
Well, I mean, when you look at the COVID rates, I mean, some people might argue that, but at the end of the day, when communities of color are being hit so hard, they are the ones that have the higher rates of hospitalizations, they have the higher rates of death. And I know, I don't know, I just feel like this is really a lack of this is a failure of our federal government to not have taken care of our families more. And I think that that's a conversation that doesn't happen a lot when we're talking about this. And I know in my school in Brooklyn Park, at least 25% of the students and their families decided to do distance learning. So I don't know. I feel like a lot of times that I don't know.
Okay. Well, Denise, could you take maybe? I'm sorry. Are you all finished?
Yes, I'm done.
I'm sorry. Sometimes on Zoom it's hard to tell. Denise, I think a little clarification about when we talk about delaying opening, whether we're talking about distance learning or just the buildings, I think was the first part of that question.
I mean, I think it should be all of the above. The start date of the school year is very arbitrary. And as I said in my comments earlier, many of our school calendars were determined a year ago, if not 2 years ago, before we even thought that or knew that there was a pandemic. So certainly start dates can and should be changed. We ended the school year in distance learning. And I appreciate many districts who said, well, that's how we ended and that's how we're going to start. And we're going to phase into, in-person learning as we are prepared and as our numbers show that we can. So there is no reason why we could not be delaying in person. There's no reason why we couldn't be delaying the start date in general. And as Maria mentioned, communities of color have spoken. Parents have answered survey after survey about how they feel, and overwhelmingly have said that distance learning is probably more safe for our students than anything else. Look, distance learning really wasn't good for anyone. I don't think that anybody ended the year last year thinking that that was super. But we are better at distance learning. We can be better. So while it's got its flaws, we know that we can improve on it. We should be improving on it. And I think that safety, I mean, we're making safety decisions here. These are health decisions. Unfortunately, in a pandemic, sometimes we have to prioritize that. And that's what's happening here in Minnesota.
All right. I think we have time for one more quick question. We're going to be respectful of people's time. And just to reiterate again, if there's a follow-up that you didn't get a chance to ask, you can contact me. My contact information is on the news release. I can reconnect with some of our speakers as well as some other educators if you need it. But our last question, and if we could be brief, comes from Emma Quinn at KBJR. And I think this one's for Sarah.
Yeah, I was just curious. I know Two Harbors is kind of a more rural area of the state, and that's The rural schools have kind of had a more harder time with this, especially up here in the Northland. And I was just curious, Sarah, if there's any challenges you anticipate this school year, especially from working from home or anything like that?
Hi. Yeah. Last year we really we had to juggle. We were super lucky that our district was able to give out hotspots to all of our students. But that being said, we had several students who live out in even more rural sections of Lake and St. Louis County that even though they had a hotspot, they still couldn't connect. So there is some big juggling acts with how do we make sure our kids have access to us every day, have access to learning, and that their learning is just as equitable as a student who is in our classroom with us. So that is definitely something that we will continue to struggle with as we move through all of our learning models.